All right, so as folks are filing in, I just want to go ahead and welcome everyone to GIS After Dark. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Cassie Hansen, and I am the Program Director for GIS and the Environmental Sciences and Policy Program at Johns Hopkins University Advanced Academic Program. And if you are interested in viewing past GIS After Dark presentations, you are welcome to visit our AAP GIS YouTube channel and see past presenters, which is filled with a lot of information. For those of you who are not familiar with our graduate program, we are a master's program, 100% online. And the class and programs are flexible. We also have opportunities for students to get into the field and play around with different drones and drone imagery. So this series was created after 2020 with the launch of the Hopkins COVID dashboard. And at that time, the GIS program put together a speaker series called Mapping a Monster, which is basically looking at all the different ways the COVID data was used. And so it's a great opportunity for us to come together, bringing GIS professionals. But as a result of Mapping a Monster in 2020, we thought that there was definitely a need to continue on the speaker series. And so that brings us to today with our GIS After Dark. So let's go ahead and let's get going. A couple of slides before I turn it over to tonight's presenter. For folks that are new to the GIS realm, this is just a little bit of a reminder of really what the geographic information system is made up of. So we use it in order for us to form and create, collect, and analyze data. And it's so important for us to represent what we know and also find out patterns of what we don't know. And this allows for us to identify the what, the when, the where, the hows of our geographic world. And GIS, as you see, and for those who have attended past sessions, we bring in practitioners from all different aspects of GIS and different industries. It could be solving crimes with GIS, to damage assessment, to making amazing maps to be used for storytelling. And it's an incredibly diverse tool that we have. And so I am so honored tonight to introduce tonight's speaker. So I would like to welcome Martin Gamache. And Martin has been advancing the field of cartography since the mid-90s. And he started, and Martin, you're gonna have to correct me, you started working at National Geographic in 2007, I believe. And since then, you've been just an integral member with your cartographic team, and now you're the chief cartographer. And I was trying to think about when I first met you, that was back in like 98. And I think at that time you were part of the Alpine Mapping Guild. And it has been incredibly just an honor to watch your talent and how you are sharing your skills with the world and how you are conveying information in the form of maps. So everyone, I'd like for you guys to give a virtual round of applause. Welcome, Martin, for being here tonight. And again, Martin, thank you for taking your time to talk to my students and everyone that's here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to you. So again, welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Cassie. I didn't realize we had met that far back.
I know, right?
It's great to be here. It's great to see such an international audience. I was born in Wawa, Ontario, so it's great to see Ontario representing. And I was just in Banff and Calgary a month ago. And I'll talk a little bit about why in a bit. So it's good to see some Canadian residents in attendance and everybody else. Thanks for showing up tonight. As Cassie said, I'm the chief cartographer for the National Geographic Society. I support a huge community of storytellers and explorers with cartography, help them tell their stories and help them get their wonderful sort of messages around the world to people who care about what we have to say, but doing it through maps and through infographics. And I have been fortunate to support several explorers in the last few years at Esri's user conference. That's where I saw Cassie this summer, and I thought I would focus on the work that I've been doing in support of those explorers. So the last 3 years, I've supported Ronan Donavan, Jeff Kerby, and Steve Boyce. All three are some of our storytellers that work primarily with wildlife and around sort of, I want to say, biology and uh, geography of plants and wildlife. So very much in the natural world, but also at the intersection of humans and the natural world. So Ronan's very interested in human carnivore conflict, which is what I'll be showing maps about. Jeff is really interested in herding and how herders could potentially help mitigate the impacts of climate change at high latitudes. And Steve is very interested in conservation work in Africa and how humans and wildlife interact there and how that's changed over time. So let's dive in. I've got some story maps that I think the links are ready to share that have been made to support all of these explorers as part of their Esri user conference keynote speeches. So what I do is I prepare exhibit material for the user conference map gallery. I prepare maps and animations for their our conference speaker sort of presentations, and then we prepare story maps that contain some of that content. And so the story maps are the leave behind, and so I want to share those with you so you'll be able to take a look at this work on your own and almost follow along because there's a lot of overlap between what I'm going to show and talk about and what's in the story maps. So I'm going to start by sharing the first one, which is about Ronan Donovan's work, and that was presented in 2022 at the user conference. And funny story, Cassie and I were here as part of this panel as part of COVID, but I didn't get COVID until I went to Esri UC in 2022. And on my way to California, I started feeling ill, and I spent a week instead of backpacking in the Sierras, I spent a week in a tent, isolating in the Sierra. And then I went to San Diego for UC, and I didn't attend UC. I spent a week in a hotel room supporting our folks remotely from the hotel. So this work was done very much as part of a COVID experiment, which is there's a little bit of irony. So can everybody see this human predator coexistence project story map?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
All right, so this was the leave behind. This is Ronan. He's an explorer. He's a photographer. He's very cool, very talented. And I started working with Ronan when we did our huge Yellowstone issue in 2015. And this is a lot of the work that he's been doing since then, looking at how the conflicts between ranchers in particular and wolves and grizzlies and other carnivores on the landscape. And he's been documenting how these things play out for 10 years now, and looking at ways to use photography to help inform better ways to manage those conflicts, better ways to help people appreciate carnivores and their role on the landscape, and also to help mitigate some of those conflicts. So we made a lot of different maps to help tell the story of these conflicts. And we were supporting not just the storytelling here, but also analysis that would help Ronan figure out where he would go to do the next round of his work. And so there was a lot of work done to model where we might have, in this case, wolf and cattle conflicts, potential conflicts. And you can see in the upper part of North America or the US in Montana, Wyoming, and Western Canada, we start seeing high probability of wolf presence, and right next to high density of cattle. And so this was sort of the angle that we push with Ronan, and one of the maps that we made was very much looking at that exact relationship on the landscape in that part of the country. And so you can see here a much higher resolution version of that map that we made with some of the modeled output. And it gave us a chance to experiment with some of the new tools that were becoming available in ArcGIS Pro, doing these multivariate choropleth. And if you've ever tried making these before, they're really hard to get done. And when I moved back to the Society in 2022, this was the first project I took on. And I was forced to suddenly switch to ArcGIS Pro after not using ArcGIS Pro for at any point before. And this was the thing that got me hooked, was the possibility of making these with, literally one click of a button. And so we really wanted to experiment with this kind of map and what we could do with it. And the other thing that we had been up until this point, one of the cartographic rules that we had was we didn't um, we didn't like blurring raster data, and we were really in a news context, in a sort of journalistic context, we thought it was problematic to distort data in a way to try to make it look smoother or nicer than it actually was at native resolution. And so I was coming from sort of this approach, and I got this raster data set that was pretty chunky looking. And here we were in a different context, not a newsworthy, not a breaking news context or storytelling in a journalistic way. It was really storytelling for impact with a different audience. And I was interested to see whether we could effectively smooth data without distorting it too much, and also keeping a sense of how it what the native resolution is, and still have it look a little bit better than it could. So I'm going to just switch out of the story map, and we're not going to go back to this one. You can peruse it at your own pace, and I will share this here. So this is a close-up of that map where you can see a little bit more of the details. And what we ended up doing was overlaying a very faint grid of white outlines of each pixel on top of the blurred imagery. So we would help retain the crispiness of the pixel so that people understood that we were representing raster data that had a native resolution, but we actually blurred the data just a little bit, just enough to smooth it out. And I thought that this was actually like a pretty good solve to something that I had struggled with, from wanting to make nice looking maps, but also not wanting to mislead people about how accurate the data was. And we imprinted sort of the raster resolution into the key. And we made sure that we told people that this was data at a certain resolution. But we thought this was a really nice approach for sort of this audience, which was not an audience of scientists or people that needed to understand the data at a really high level. So we made a number of other maps as part of this exercise. One of them was repurposing a map supplement that we did in 2015 on Yellowstone elk, which was the first time that all these elk herds around Yellowstone that migrated in and out of the park every year were mapped. We worked with a number of agencies and scientists to do that, and we really sort of spread the word about this mass migration in a way that hadn't been told before. And we went back to that map and decided, okay, well, what if we were to repurpose this to talk about wolves? And so we went back to the map. We took the files. We after 8 years, if you've ever gone back 8 years on a digital project, you might be surprised at how hard it is to open old files and get them into the right coordinate system and working in whatever version of software you're working now. But we were successful, and what we needed to do was add wolf data. Well, it turns out that elk data is a lot easier to find than wolf data, especially when you're dealing with wildlife management agencies from multiple states, federal level agencies that manage species that are problematic or endangered or at risk, and a number of native communities that manage wildlife on their own. So we had been ambitious and thought we would be able to map the wolf packs for the entire map area that we had done, like we had done for elk. But it turns out we were only able to do Wyoming, because Wyoming was the only state that was very public about their wolf management. And they publish a report every year. The report has very good maps and statistics associated with it. And they share data about wolf packs to a certain extent in a way that the other states don't. So we decided to focus on Wyoming, and we also obtained cattle ranching data to add to the map, which we had never done before. And if you've ever worked with ranch allocations and the way that public lands are managed for cattle grazing, that's a whole sort of ball of string that's pretty complicated to tease apart. So in the end, we had thought we would be looking at densities of cattle and looking at much more granular data, but it turns out that it's pretty difficult to do that. And what we ended up doing was just looking at where there was cattle and where there wasn't. And that turned out to be enough for the story we were trying to tell. So you can see here, these are the wolf packs with the number of wolves that are in proximity to Yellowstone National Park, where we have wolves that are resident, and we have wolves that were reintroduced in the 90s and that have since spread outside of the park and started to interact with humans and human uses on the landscape, like cattle grazing, and also elk and other wildlife that hunters tend to prize over the wolves. And so what we wanted to show was that there was conflict, but also that there was a lot less conflict than people thought. And we also looked at how much cattle was being killed or deprecated by the wolves, and then how many wolves were being shot by ranchers as a result of that. And so for each pack, we looked through the entire time period that we had access to and counted and created a data set of the number of wolves that have been shot and the number of animals that had been attacked. And quickly we understood that the problem of wolf predating on cattle was wildly overblown, and that the real issue was people just going out and shooting wolves. And for a couple of packs, there was no evidence that the packs had been shooting cattle. And so this analysis was done at this really granular level as an example of what we would like to do over a much bigger area. It was kind of a proof of concept that given the right data, you can start teasing out some stories, and you can start telling stories that can be used to convince people that, hey, maybe the problem's not as bad as you think it is. So this was very rewarding to really dig into a wildlife data set that hadn't been used in this way before. And nobody had put these two things together. And even for just a small area, it was really powerful to see these two things overlaid together. So Ronan then took this work after UC. He had a huge exhibit at the museum in Jackson Hole, whose name I forget now. It's like a big cowboy museum. So we created a bunch more mapping content for his exhibit. And so we were really interested in telling the stories of individual wolves on the landscape, both in Yellowstone, but also up in the Canadian Arctic, where he had been working on Arctic wolves. And so we repurposed that same map from Yellowstone again, and we decided to look at one particular pack and one particular individual wolf within that pack and tell her story. And so that's what this map does here. It looks at I forget the name of the wolf. I think it's 980M, which is a female wolf that was part of Molly's pack. Molly's is one of the longest studied packs in Yellowstone. If you ever go to Yellowstone and are interested in wolves, you'll hear about Molly's pack. And in this particular instance, we had a really interesting story of a wolf that was kind of a matriarch to that pack. There's conflicts between packs. There's winter crossing of Yellowstone Lake on the ice that's documented in the color data. And in the end, this animal gets kicked by an elk and dies. And so it's a story with a little bit of drama, and quite a long arc, both spatially and narratively, that we thought was really interesting. And for a museum exhibit, these are the kinds of stories that we are looking for. And then we went looking for a story like this for a wolf up in the Canadian Arctic. So this is the map that we made for the exhibit up in Ellesmere in the high Canadian Arctic, where there are wolf packs that are, have very different behavior and that some people think are different species. And we looked at wolf W445 and again, a very long trek that this wolf did well outside of its range, dispersing south across pack ice, coming near to communities while they're having huge multi-day events. The wolf goes really far out of its way to avoid the community during that time. And at some point, the color just stops working and we lose track of her. And so an interesting story of dispersal over a really large area that allows us to take a look at this landscape through mapping, through the use of satellite image. We love getting seasonal image that's timed to the GPS color data. And so this image was an image that was acquired by Modis during the time that the wolf was there. So when we see the wolf go up to the Polina in the sound here, it goes up right to the edge and we can actually see the edge in the imagery. So really important to try to sync up these things whenever possible, because that environmental data that's so clearly visible in the imagery helps explain some of the patterns that you're seeing, especially when it comes to wildlife dispersal. So let's switch gears. We're going to go back to a story map, and this time we're going to go to our explorer, Steve Boyce, who we support in 2023. Steve works in Angola and Botswana in the Okavango Delta. He's been working there for, I'm not going to make up a number, a long time. He's been doing transects of the Okavango every year and expanding his work, tracing rivers to their sources, establishing where they start, looking for source lakes, and in the case of this particular watershed, looking for the water tower that is the source of all these major rivers in Africa, the Congo, the Zambezi, and remapping the source of these major rivers of the world, and rewriting our knowledge of how these water, where the water comes from that flows into these massive rivers. So Steve and his team have been mapping peat up in the highlands of Angola. And let me just share. Hopefully you can all see the lifeline of the Okavango Delta. Yes. And this is the story map that was left behind from our work with Steve in 2023. So Steve used to give talks about his work and talk about the Okavango Delta and say he was holding a box of sand and pretend he was pouring water over it and talking about how the water flows. And he'd been doing this for years, and he needed a better way to communicate the hydrology of the Okavango Delta. And so we offered to make an animation that would do that. And so we've got enough time today to, I think, watch the whole thing. So I'm going to play the whole thing because I think this is probably Steve explaining it in a way that makes the most sense, but you get to see the work that we did to support the storytelling, working in a 3D environment, working in an animated dynamic environment to do storytelling with maps, the way that we had never done before, and that I think is pretty effective in this case.
In Africa's arid regions, highland water towers play an important role in storing and providing fresh water which sustains life downstream. The Okavango Delta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Botswana, lies in the semi-arid Kalahari Desert, but its source is hundreds of kilometers away in the Angolan highlands. Angola's landscape is dominated by the highlands of the BA Plateau. Its rainy season lasts from September to April, with its heaviest rainfall in the north and on the cooler central plateau. The highlands supply water to 11 river subbasins, 8 of them transboundary, including source waters of the Congo and the Zambezi, and the key tributaries of the Okavango, the Quito and Kubangu rivers. These highlands are an important regional water tower despite the absence of snow cover. The area lacked a defined boundary, which hindered conservation efforts. For that reason, the National Geographic Okavango Wilderness Project identified the Angolan Highlands Water Tower as an area of the BA Plateau above 1,274 meters. Annually, this water tower supplies an average of 423 cubic kilometers of water. However, the contribution to each subbasin varies. The Okavango's catchment is shared by Angola, Namibia, and Botswana. It's estimated that over 95% of the water that flows into the Okavango Delta via the Quito and Kubangu rivers falls as rain in the Angolan highlands. This crucial rainfall accumulates in source lakes and extensive peatlands in a highland region known locally as the Zima ya Mowono, meaning the source of life. In spite of their overlapping rainy seasons and adjacent headwaters, the water reaches the delta from these two rivers at different rates. The longer Kubangu runs a steeper, faster path over compacted soils and feeds the first Okavango flood pulse between January and March. Meanwhile, the meandering Quito seeps through extensive spongy peatlands and feeds the second surge in April and May, then sustains the delta through the dry season. The extent of flooding in the Okavango appears strongly correlated to the amount of early rainfall. The water tower's wettest year on record, 2011, led to the largest known inundation, while the 2019 drought produced the smallest recorded flood area. Defining the Angolan Highlands Water Tower and quantifying its contributions to rivers downstream will help with the conservation of this critical freshwater resource.
All right, so as you can see, moving things on maps can be pretty powerful and can help bring to life dynamic systems like hydrology and climate in a really effective way. So that was a really successful attempt at doing that kind of narrative-driven dynamic mapping. And Steve shared this on the stage at Esri user conference for the first time, and since then it's been used to tell his story all over the world, and it's currently being adapted into a Werner Herzog film with Werner narrating our footage. So that's going to be a really cool experience for us, to say the least. But as part of this project, we also created a number of other maps to drive some of the content at the conference, including maps showing Steve's expeditions and Steve's sort of the landscape of the Angola Highlands that are more static, that are more traditional maps. And so that was a lot of fun. We got to map every one of their expedition transects over time. We got to make this wonderful sort of big bird's eye view of this part of Africa with Eric Knight in one of his sort of classic illustrated style. And we got to adapt these for the story map as well. And so I'll go back to it in a second here. And you can see that coming out of the film, in the story map, we now go into a 3D environment where we replicate some of the storytelling. People can move around and experiment on their own. They can look at the gauges that we have in the system and look at real-time data. And there's some more things that we can do, both with dashboard type elements and with static mapping in the story map. So lots of fun, lots of new things to learn for us in how to do this kind of storytelling, but also leveraging our experience doing static mapping to leave some things behind and share in our museum, share it in the museum in Angola. And so these static maps still have a role to play and can be really powerful documents in of their own. So last year, we worked with Jeff Kerby, who is one of our storyteller. We like to say that he's one of the few scientists that is actually like a phenomenal photographer. He's been able to use his photography both as a tool to capture scientific data and document wildlife behavior in a really rigorous way through automating the capture and the analysis of the imagery, but also make beautiful images that are the hallmark of a great photographer. So he's really interested in plants. He's really interested in the Arctic, and he's really interested in how the Arctic is changing. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of the work that we did to support his talk this past July on the greening of the Arctic. And this is the story map. We did some animation of NDVI over a year using really high frequency imagery, looking at snow from MODIS and looking at sea ice and putting all these things together in a looping animation, data that normally is all apart. And so that was one of the big things that we created for his presentation, was this dynamic tool to help explain what's going on in the Arctic and why it's special. And then we looked at solar granite carbon, and we looked at the warming in the Arctic, which is the fastest warming place on the planet right now. And Jeff has been looking using the satellite record at how much the Arctic is greening. There's lots of people that are doing this. He's got a certain way of doing it. I'm not going to try to explain it, but this is the outcome of that work. And he's particularly interested in northern Greenland, which is seeing some of the most dramatic changes. And so our story takes place on the northernmost point of land in the world. It's a small island off the tip of Greenland. And Jeff and his collaborators went there to try to document the northernmost flower as part of an expedition. And so we were able to take his drone imagery and create a 3D model using drone map of the island, and then to look at where they had captured this little poppy, and also documented this very cute little weasel. And you can see more of that work on his website. As part of this expedition, we were also interested in doing repeat photography and lining up images from the 1930s with imagery from today. And so we were successful at doing that and analyzing how the vegetation has changed using those repeat images, and combining that with an analysis of Landsat data, the entire Landsat catalog. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But the story map explains some of Jeff's work. And for his talk and for the exhibit, we created this view of this valley in Greenland, which combines Maxar imagery and high resolution terrain model from the Arctic DM project with that analysis of the entire Landsat catalog of images to show where there's been the most greening in this landscape. And you can see all of these plots, circular plots, essentially capture all the pixels within there and summarize the trend through those pixels in the entire, for every cloud-free pixel that's there. And so you can see in some places quite a lot of greening happening. So this was a scene that was, I think, 72 inches across that we plotted out for our exhibit, and that was rendered also in the 3D environment in ArcGIS Pro, so that Jeff was able to navigate the scene and kind of fly around in it and go and look at particular specific landscape changes, either in the topography, like fluvial channel changes and collapses, looking at permafrost change, looking at retreating glaciers, and looking at the amount of vegetation. So really fun project. Always fun to be able to work with really high resolution imagery and terrain models and be able to make these beautiful renders. So switching gear again, that's kind of the end of the Esri user speaker support that we've been doing. Some of the other projects that we've been working on are large format map supplements. So last year we prepared a map of the Ukraine and the Ukraine conflict to sort of commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the conflict. So we created a map supplement showing Ukraine's geography and the front lines of Ukraine and sort of the new geography of Eastern Ukraine, where the theater war was, looking at some of the drivers and the consequences of the conflict, and looking at the history of NATO in Europe, the history of Ukraine through a timeline, and also looking at the energy geography of this part of the world to try to get a sense of what was driving some of the consequences of the conflict. So we spent about 6 months developing this map supplement, and sadly, this conflict is not yet over, and we are currently working with another storyteller to look at the environmental consequences of this conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbass region, and looking at sort of what will be left behind when this war is over, through photography, video, and sort of narrative journalism by 2 journalists that are explorers with the society. So more to come on this topic, and it's kind of a interesting time to be picking this up again. One other project that I will talk about is a film called For Winter, which premiered at the Banff Film Festival last month. And that film is about scientist Alison Criscitello, who's another one of our explorers. And Alison is a glaciologist and mountaineer and mountain guide. And she has been working up on Mount Logan, the highest peak in Canada, drilling probably the deepest non-polar ice core up there. And we made a film about her work and about her and her family and her story. And the film is about sort of climate change and sort of the consequences on our winters. So if you're into winter sports like I am, this is kind of a little bit of an alarm bell.
Winter, what does Mama do for work?
You do ice.
I do ice time.
And do science.
And I do science. What is it that I drill?
Real ice core.
Ice core. Do you know why?
Because you were ice core science.
I'm an ice core scientist. I was gone for a while. I missed you a lot.
He cannot get out of here under his own power.
If you miss me when I'm gone for work, what you do when you miss me?
Make art.
You made me cards just like I made you cards. We made each other cards.
He says, "This is an elephant to help you feel better when you miss us."
Winter, why do you like sledding?
Because it's about the speed.
It is. Okay, I have an existential question for you. What would happen if we didn't have snow anymore?
What would happen?
So we made a number of maps for this film and some really cool 3D renderings of Allison's drilling and where she was drilling on the mountain and why she was drilling there to try to explain the science. And I'll just show some of that. So we have some 3D animated maps, and then this cool rendering that takes us below the summit plateau of Mount Logan using ground penetrating radar imagery and some clever use of parallax effects and recreating the drone footage of the skiers coming across the plateau to explain why we're drilling in this particular spot. So some fun cartographic-ish type work. But the more exciting part of what we are doing next with this project is that we are creating a new map of Mount Logan for the centenary of the first ascent, which is going to be in June of this coming year of 2025. So let's see if I can get back to this. So in 1968, we sponsored an expedition on the border between Alaska and the Yukon to climb then this unnamed peak called Mount Kennedy. It was the highest unclimbed peak in Canada, and the Canadian government wanted to commemorate the assassination of President Kennedy, and so they offered to name a peak after him. And his brother and an expedition from the National Geographic Society went to climb it, and it had not been climbed. And as part of this effort, Bradford Washburn, who is one of my cartographic sort of heroes and inspirations, he worked with the Swiss to create this map of Mount Kennedy and Mount Hubbard and Mount Alverstone. It's a kind of a very interesting map that only has blue and brown on it. It's a completely glaciated alpine landscape, and they made the most detailed map of it that had ever been made. And we are looking to this map as a source of inspiration for how we're going to tackle Mount Logan. And so we've started work on this map. This is the prototype map sheet with a rendering of the entire 30 plus kilometer long massif of Mount Logan, which is just a humongous mountain with these long treacherous ridges that come off the top of it. And we are hard at work trying to repair and patch all the data voids in the Arctic DEM on the southern aspect of this mountain, where it's steep and dark and poorly illuminated, and where satellite data is hard to get. And so there's a lot of some of the steeper, more interesting parts of this mountain are constantly obscured and in the shadows or under cloud cover. And so the data is poor. And most of the rest of the area, it's quite good. And so we have a 2-meter DEM that's highly accurate and full of details, except where we need it the most, which are the steepest parts and the more interesting parts of the mountain. So we're trying to figure out how to fix this and create a 1 to 50,000 scale map of this whole mountain for climbers to be able to use. One of the point that Allison makes in the film is because of climate change, this mountain is changing drastically. What used to be sort of a ski mountaineering climb, long and difficult because of the elevation and the climbing, the weather that climbers would encounter, is now much harder because of the deteriorating conditions on some of the easier glacier ascents. And so year to year now, it's quite unclear what to expect. And so we're hoping this map is going to be something that climbers can take with them in the field. And we're putting it out there as a freebie. So it's not going to be sold by us, and it's going to be sort of something that climbers can take on a device and use as a digital map or print out so that they have a paper copy with them. But it's going to be created in a style that replicates a combination of the Washburn style that was used on the Mount Kennedy map, and also our Trails Illustrated sort of commercial topographic map. And Eric Knight is working on this beautiful rendering down below that's still in early prototyping phase, but we will have sort of that southern aspect of the mountain where all those big routes like the Hummingbird Ridge come off of. And so where most of the hard climbing is, we'll have a view of all that aspect. This map will be our first chance to showcase a new cartographic typeface that we're also working on. This is the first cartographic typeface that we've developed in almost 100 years. It's going to be used to for building sort of peripheral elements on a map, not necessarily labeling geographic features, but more for cartouches and scales and map notes. And some of the maps I was showcasing earlier have been readapted using that typeface as we're testing it over the last couple of months. We've been remaking a lot of the maps that I've been showing today using that typeface to see how it works in an actual cartographic production environment. And so as we get new betas and new versions of it, we remake these maps and see how it looks. So you can see some of the ragging on these notes isn't quite so elegant because we've been playing around with swapping fonts in and out. So that's the last of what I have to show today. I've got we have a hub. There's 2 hubs online that are useful perhaps for you guys if you're interested in this. We have this one that we host, which is a hub of our some of the story maps and some of the mapping resources that we have. And then Esri also has a hub of all National Geographic Explorer stories that have been built so far. So I can share that link as well. If you're interested in using story maps to do some storytelling, using maps and videos and images, it's a really powerful tool. We're using it more and more to sort of adapt our storytelling approaches without having to bring really powerful web development skills to bear and without having access to a lot of those resources. When we do build websites, we do so infrequently. And so for more everyday stuff, we use story maps quite a bit. So feel free to have a look at those and see if there's anything you like there. And I'm happy to answer questions, Cassie. And
Thank you, Martin. Literally, your presentation has everything that we've been talking about in our cartography class, from 3D rendering to typeface to creating maps for different purposes and different platforms. So you have some folks in the chat window here that are saying, yes, please share those links if you can, the portal links, that would be wonderful. We can send it out afterwards too. So I would, thank you so much. Let's give Martin a virtual round of applause. And we would love to open it up for questions that you may have. I know that there's probably a couple of you guys that have questions. I did have one question, Martin. With the use of story maps, how has that changed your workflow from when, creating static maps for the magazine to now the online presence? Has it changed much, or how do you approach it?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. One of the ones I had called up that I didn't show was one that we made last year. At the end of the year, we were working on a project called Perpetual Planet, which has been deployed on Everest and Mount Logan. Allison's film was part of that funding as part of the mountain component of it. Then we had an Amazon component that just wrapped up, and we're starting an ocean component now. And as part of our Amazon storytelling, we built a story map for Explorer that works with dolphins and in the Amazon. And it was a huge learning experience for us to build a story map without having done any of the static mapping, and to kind of really think about how we knew what the story was we wanted to tell, but it was really hard to start working on it. One of the things we learned is we need to write a script first. And once and that's not so much different than making a print map. I mean, one of the exercises I've always encouraged my staff to do, and I do myself, is like write down what it is that the map's going to do. and start writing map notes. What are the things that you want the map to say and show and tell? And so it's always fun to work through that exercise. Once you have data, it's like, okay, what do I want to tell with this data, and writing it out. And then you write it out and you're like, that's not really that interesting, or that's not really, like, it's pretty self-evident. So, and sometimes that's okay. Sometimes, like, calling out the obvious is the point of the map, because it may be obvious to you, but not to everybody else. But working through the script and then doing the storyboarding are the first steps when you're doing these things. And then once you do that, then you can start actually building stuff. And luckily, we're working with really incredible photography and video assets, so we have a lot to work with. But sometimes it's almost like that makes it harder. There's too many things. There's too many. It becomes editing the content that you're going to put on there is really important, and not trying to do everything in one story map. It's better to have two amazing story maps than one that's too long and that doesn't have it. That's just confusing. And so that's the same as making a map. Sometimes you need 3 maps, not one that has 3 different things going on at the same time. So some of the lessons are having to relearn things we already know how to do in a static environment, but learning it in this new tool.
Thank you. I'll pause for a moment. I have another question, but I'll let the students, if they have any questions, go ahead and ask them. Good. We got a question. So David has a question. Are there any remote sensing, satellite capabilities, or large data sets that you're aware of that are relatively new or coming online in the near future that you've used or you're excited about?
No. I will say, I think Esri's got a new product that's going to be launching in the next 12 months. That's going to be a hub for accessing satellite imagery from all the providers in one place, and sort of licensing and acquiring rights and looking for imagery from basically every provider. They're trying to build a hub for satellite imagery that's going to live within the GIS environment. Right now, you can do that with Planet. There's a tool that works fairly well, but there's going to be, hopefully this tool will help finding the kind of imagery that you need. I'm a little out of the loop on new data stuff because I'm kind of pretty removed. I think one thing I will say is tools like Google Earth Engine, and I know that there's other tools like it that are being developed, and thinking about imagery less as like a one place, one time kind of static thing, and thinking of imagery as these deep data sets with thousands of like data cubes essentially, and stopping to think of them as images, but really they're just big data sets. I think that's and having the tools to work with them that way. I think that experiment with Jeff looking at that small landscape, but looking at 30 years of Landsat imagery and summarizing every one of those pixels into these sort of individual data sets and looking at the trends through that. It's a different way to think about data, and it's one that I think is going to change how we use imagery, beyond like it being an image that you're using your eyes to consume, or using algorithms to try to interpret. It turns it into raw data that can tell us very different stories. So I think there's going to be better tools to start doing some of that stuff, and that's probably one of the things I'm more interested in, is working with people that are doing that and figuring out ways to map that kind of stuff and visualize that kind of stuff, because all the ways that we've been doing it, it's going to require new ways to do storytelling with maps to tell those stories.
Thank you. And great question. So I'll pause for a second. We have a couple more minutes for one last question, and if you guys don't have one, I have one. All right. So Martin, for folks that are just starting out in this industry, I know you've seen changes throughout the progression of story maps and from static maps to more digital maps. What advice do you have to give to them regarding how they make a break within the industry? What can you share with them?
I get asked this question all the time, and my answer has not changed over the years. I think really strong quantitative skills. So not being scared of stats and stats in particular. And then the coding skills to build the kind of tools and to modify tools and code to do what you need to do that you can't do with the software, and being able to work programmatically in places like Google Earth Engine that really require you to have some basis in that, and whatever that language is, just being comfortable working that way as opposed to working through a GUI. And so those are the two things I would say. And then if you're interested in the cartography stuff, yeah, take all the cartography classes, but also take classes in graphic design and go outside of your school if you have to do that. Take classes online, go to an art school in your community and take, the printmaking classes and the graphic design classes, and go consume as much art as you can, because that's how you're going to learn to deploy to use sort of the artistry and the aesthetic sort of approach to doing this stuff in a smart way. And I think that's when you can do those two sides of it, and you cultivate those two sides of those two types of skill sets, that's where you become a really incredible map maker. And if you only focus on one element, you might be really good at one thing, but you're in terms of employability, there's not a lot of employers looking for somebody that can just place type on a map really well. That was a job 75 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, that was wonderful. And so for cartography students that are here tonight, I know that there's many examples that you guys can pull inspiration from. And I know that the advice that Martin's giving you, there's so many classes, within the program for you to consider, our GIS for programming course, as well as our spatial statistics course. And then our even our GI science open source courses are all available as well. So the things to consider. Do you have time for one last question, Martin?
I do.
Okay, Radian said she lost power, dropped out for a few minutes, so she wanted to know who is your inspiration, who you pull from.
Well, I mentioned Bradford Washburn. So if you don't know who he is, I encourage you to look him and his wife Barbara up. They were associated with the Museum of Science in Boston, but also National Geographic Society and University of Fairbanks in Alaska, and just really accomplished sort of. They embodied sort of the non-specialist, sort of do everything yourself kind of ethos. Bradford got in planes and started taking pictures hanging out of the window, and they climbed and just really high energy, do everything and try everything kind of people, but also really kind people and really generous people. Tom Patterson is incredibly generous with his time and his resources. Eric Knight is now a frequent collaborator of mine, and Eric's taught me a lot about how to create beautiful maps, and it's been amazing to work with him. My former colleague, Ginny Mason, is working at Platts and working in the oil industry, but doing a lot of incredible storytelling there with mapping and really kind of telling incredible stories with on the topic that you wouldn't expect there to be so much opportunity. So she's really doing great work there. Colleagues at National Geographic like Debbie Gibbons and Matt Chwostek, always inspiring me and always amazing to work with them. So yeah.
Well, thank you. I think one of the books that I truly enjoyed was The Accidental Adventurer, and it was the story behind the Washburn family and their adventures in Alaska and surveying, and also Wager Against the Wind, with the pilots that take them out on the glaciers and land. So
yeah, if you have a chance to look at any of his photography books, but reading the narratives of their climbs. Barbara was the first woman to climb Denali, and when Bradford went to climb Lucania, they were basically lost in the wilderness for for months and barely survived. Not the climbing part, it was the coming out of the mountains part that almost killed him. So there's lots of great stories there. But, you know, Bradford also ran the Museum of Science in Boston and was a, you know, kind of a museum administrator and an organizer of things. And when I read his correspondence with the National Geographic, he was an annoying mother. and he was, you know, persistent and just kind of didn't stop. I mean, he just was annoyingly so. But he got so much work done, so many incredible things off the ground because he was persistent. And
Very
if you
passionate.
go and look at the maps that he made of Mount Washington and New Hampshire and his, you know, where his family had a cottage on Squam Lake, and you know, they're all like these incredible maps that nobody cared. He did these things for himself, and that to me is what inspires me is the energy and the drive and the vision to just make incredible maps. And that's never left me ever since I've heard about him. It's been an inspiration.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for sharing, you know, the slides and the stories and your examples of amazing work. And I just want to say thank you for coming back and you know, sharing with what you've been doing. And we're so happy to have you here. And I know my students are going to walk away with just more inspiration. And yeah, thank you so much, Martin. And for folks that are joining us tonight, thanks for being here. I know that you are busy working on your finals and everyone is busy with life. And again, you know, the first Thursday of each month, we have these sessions. So go ahead and, you know, look for those announcements. We welcome you, and please stay engaged in our community. And so with that said, I just wish you happy holidays. Martin, thank you so much for being here, and we will see you in the new year.